So how's Ava doing post-accident?
Yeah, really well. Just incredibly tired still, and randomly collapses, which we haven't quite got to the bottom of yet, but generally, rocking it.
What actually happened when you got that call?
Yeah, so Ava was 3.5, and with my dad so that I could come back to work full time, my mum and my dad actually, and she was in the field. My parents live on a farm, as you know. And a horse came up behind her and sniffed her head and made her jump. And she fell sideways and screamed. So the horses ran off, and my mum was an acre away, so didn't see what happened. Mm-hmm. And obviously came up to Ava to find out what was going on. My dad heard the commotion and came up from the house, and I got a call at 4 o'clock on a Friday and thought, something's happened. Mm-hmm. I just knew something had happened. And my dad basically just said, look, Ava's fallen, she's not acting herself, I've called a paramedic, you need to meet us at hospital. Right. And that's the point at which I then ran down the corridor because I didn't have my car.
Yeah, asking people to
take me to hospital. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we then got there before her. And so I said to Dave, who'd come from home, oh, this is fine, she's not been blue lighted, this is just going to be concussion. And we waited in the ambulance bay, and the lady in A&E had said, she's next in. So we saw the ambulance coming, no blue lights, all is fine, right? So I got into the back of the ambulance, and she was in my mum's arms, unconscious, grey, she had vomit in her mouth. And the paramedic said to me, it's fine, she's a little bit sleepy, she said her tummy hurt, but I'm not worried. And I looked at him and said, but she said she bumped her head when she fell, and she's vomited, presumably because she's bumped her head. I think you need to treat this as a head injury. And if it's not, great. If it is and we miss it, not great.
Yeah. And
so I was then put onto the bed with Ava. She was in my arms, and her eyes would sort of flicker open, and I could see the sort of panic in her face, and then she'd not be able to stay awake and would fall unconscious again. And I'm in this queue in A&E with this paramedic saying, really don't worry, this isn't a head injury. And there's people lined up ahead of me that were obviously a lot less poorly. And I said, look, you really do need to treat this as a head injury. I absolutely know she is unconscious. I can't wake her up. I've tried tickling her. She's incredibly ticklish. I can't wake her up. Please treat this as a head injury. And I was getting quite cross. And I raised my voice, and a doctor walked past me, took one look at Ava and said, you come with me. She needs an emergency CT scan. And from there, everything just happened.
Yeah. How long ago was that now?
So it was, by coincidence, it will be 7 years on the 26th of May, which coincides with Action for Brain Injury Week, which obviously we support as a team.
Yeah.
And I advocate for the power of parents trusting their instincts and the basics, really, of managing a head injury for a child.
Absolutely. How was her recovery?
Well, so she was airlifted to Bristol Children's Hospital, which was something like I've never seen. I went in the helicopter with Ava, and we landed on the top of Southmead, and then we had to be blue lighted to Bristol Children's Hospital, and she then went in for a craniotomy. So it's where they cut through the skull, drain the bleed, and she had an extradural hematoma, so a big 8 centimetre bleed to the side of her head. And they all do it so clever without touching the brain, and then put it all back together again. And she has the most awesome scar on her head. And so obviously she was in intensive care initially and made a really good recovery. So the risk was loss of use of her right side, that's right, and loss of speech for the area of the brain that was affected. And, she just made a really good recovery. Slow, but really good. And we were then downgraded to high dependency, where we could stay with her, so we didn't have to leave her at all, thankfully. And astonishingly, within 4 days, we were home.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Considering sort of the extent of the injury.
Yeah. And a year later, I suddenly realised that I wasn't right myself. And I was conscious that Ava had been having nightmares and she'd been having flashbacks and things like that. And so the focus just wasn't on me. And then all of a sudden, she was better and I wasn't.
Yeah.
And subsequently was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which I know is something that we support parents through after they've had. We do, don't we? And so I had to have fairly intensive treatment. And thankfully, I've made amazing recovery, largely due to the amount of support around me, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm all right now.
So obviously you're an associate in the medical negligence team at Tozers.
Yeah.
And you do support parents of brain injured children or children that have been affected by head injuries, such as Ava. How do you think your experience affects how you run these cases and how you support your clients?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You're right, you know, we do have to support clients, and it's that full support, so they feel that we can give them everything they need to get through the litigation. And I think being able to genuinely empathise when you've been through trauma yourself, and with Ava or any other traumatic experience that life chucks at you, it definitely shapes you and allows you to empathise and to recognise perhaps injuries that they might not have seen, and to, as you asked me, how are you? How are you, mum? How are you, dad? What support might you need? And is there something that we can help you with? Can we signpost you to a charity? Can you, we support you in reaching out to mental health services? And also understanding, I suppose, both that physical and the psychiatric injury and the impact of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was lucky. I had an understanding employer who didn't question how long I had off, who just put the support mechanisms in for me, and I went on immediate compassionate leave and returned when I was ready.
Yeah. And was that paid?
Paid,
Yeah.
yeah.
Obviously, if it's not, that can really impact your way of living.
That's just it, isn't it? And lots of people don't have that, and therefore they end up either not being able to return to work or with a hefty loss of earnings claim that they then have to factor in. How am I going to pay the mortgage?
Yeah.
How am I going to pay these bills? And so there's that aspect of it, and also, understanding all of those additional care needs that the child affected might have, or whoever it is who suffered any kind of injury, what that care looks like, and how we can put provisions in place to make their life easier. I've been there, I've done it, to a lesser degree, admittedly, but you can still see it and feel it.
Yeah, absolutely.